Oh, hello. This is Wade Frazier. This is August 25th, 2026, 10:11 a.m. This post is going to be on California, where I was raised. My parents were born and raised in Bellingham, Washington, near the Canadian border, but they discovered sunshine when my father was in the Marine Corps. And when he returned from Korea, they moved to Seattle. My father attended the University of Washington, and they soon had me. But after graduation, my father graduated from UW. My family moved back down to California. And other than a year in Houston, when he worked at Mission Control and NASA, my father never left. So he spent the rest of his life in California. I tried to move back to Seattle several times before the most recent attempt took in 1997. My fourth attempt was when I met Dennis Lee. And the last place I wanted to be was back in Southern California, but I ended up there. Wasn't my choice. And I soon found myself back in my hometown of Ventura, and where my life was soon ruined. And I've been picking up the pieces of my life ever since. And many lives were shattered by the events in Ventura, as the global elite ensured that the threat that we posed was dealt with. However, we lived to try again. And here I am, still trying. Um, It was only after the raid, when we were raided and they stole our technical material and stuff. Our head research was never the same after that. That's when I began to understand how corrupt Ventura County was. I grew up 3 miles from the county center where my life was wrecked. And growing up, yeah, I had no idea. But I eventually learned that Ventura County is long been ranked as one of the most corrupt counties in the United States. It's even ranked number one. In fact, the Rodney King beating verdict was rendered in Ventura County. And I think that LA knew that Ventura County would be a friendly jurisdiction to the cops. Um, I read Gary Wean's book in January of 1989. I'd already been radicalized. But his book was still traumatic reading. And I was learning that what was happening to us was not that unusual in the United States. And Gary said it happened all the time. However, California seemed to be in a class of its own in ways. And I'm going to get into that in this post. So, Harry Pregerson, he was a protege of Mickey Cohen, the legendary Jewish gangster. Gary thought that Cohen paid for Pregerson's law school. And in fact, there's a freeway interchange in LA named after Pregerson. And during Gary's ordeals, he learned that the Ninth Circuit federal court, where Pregerson presided, was considered the most corrupt in the United States. And I soon learned that firsthand also. So the court handed down a ruling in Dennis's case that admitted that it did not matter if the officials were criminals and committed crimes. The official word was, yeah, it doesn't matter if they're criminals or not. It doesn't matter what crimes they commit. In fact, they threatened to disbar Dennis's attorney, who was actually the leading constitutional attorney in the United States, who actually sent IRS agents to prison. And and he got the education of his life taking on Dennis's case. Yeah, they tried to disbar him, and so he got humbled. The IRS was nobody compared to what he was facing there, in California. And then the California officials kangarooed Dennis into prison for not filing a form, tried to get him killed by the inmates, which nearly worked. Dennis got lucky and only had some fingers broken and teeth knocked out. Through Gary's reporting in the book I read back in '89, I learned that John Kennedy was not killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, which means that all American presidents ever since were puppets. In fact, JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy, he was likely taken out because he planned to reopen the investigation into JFK's death because he thought the Warren Commission was just a cover-up. And in fact, Gary handed evidence regarding JFK's death to Bobby the day before Bobby was murdered in Los Angeles. Yeah, all All overlaps, comes together. And after all that, nothing that happened in California really could surprise me. But I kept running into others who had similar experiences in California. And this post is going to summarize some of them. So early during my days of study, which began after I left Ventura, I soon encountered the work of Rodney Stich. And Rodney Stich was another overgrown Boy Scout, like so many of us were. And he was a World War II fighter pilot who became an FAA investigator who was assigned in the 1960s to investigate several United Airlines plane crashes. And he discovered that poorly trained pilots were crashing the planes and that the FAA colluded with United Airlines to cover it up. So Rodney was another one of those disillusioned idealists that I've written about so much. And Rodney woke up the hard way. We all woke up the hard way. And Rodney eventually wrote Unfriendly Skies. So he was an early whistleblower. And once he did that, went public like that, he began to get contacted by spooks, CIA contract agents and the like. And he got it way over his head. His ride really became surreal. And Rodney, as fate would have it, lived in California. But he had been divorced for like 30 years or something. But the CIA, a CIA front law firm, actually sued to have the state of California would not recognize his divorce, which I think he got in Texas, which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled a century ago or something that one state cannot refuse to recognize a divorce got in another state. It's all there. It didn't matter. Yeah, they can just make it up as they go in California. They had absolutely no legal standing for what they did. And they did that as a way to strip away Stich's net worth. He was worth $6 million before this assault happened. And once they take your money, it's easy to kangaroo into prison, which they did. So Stich got kangarooed into prison in California by the CIA and friends for exposing all the evil activities that they engaged in. In fact, when I met Gary, he told me how he smuggled a tape recorder into the witness stand hidden in his coat to catch the court altering his testimony transcripts. Yes, the courts would actually alter what was said in court. That's just how kangaroo court works. And and Gary told me of an instance where he watched them, as he was testifying, he watched them erase from the transcript his testimony. That's how it works there in Ventura County. Well, Rodney experienced even worse. So he saw where they altered the transcripts to state the opposite of what was testified to. That's how California courts work. And in fact, the Warren Commission was also notorious for altering witness testimony to state the opposite of what they actually said. Yeah, this is quite a trick. American style justice. Rodney became privy to the tapes on the wiretap of J. Edgar Hoover's phone. Yeah, the FBI actually tapped Hoover's phone, and they had tapes of him planning the John Kennedy hit with Lyndon Johnson, Nelson Rockefeller, George Bush I, and Allen Dulles. Yeah, which is not a surprise to me. Rodney was actually far more conservative in his work than Gary was. Rodney tried to stay away from so-called conspiracy theories. He had to be super documented, etc. And he had the documentation. He had the goods on this stuff. I traded email with Rodney once when he was still alive. I think back in the 90s. And Rodney was involved in the aftermath of Paul Wiltzer's murder by the spooks there in D.C. So he was a muckraker in D.C. and he dug in too deep, and the spooks murdered him. And Rodney was actually he was involved in the aftermath before they discovered his body. Discovered was again the spooks. They murder you, and then they try to make it look like something else. This is free energy, people. This is normal when they murder you. So muckraking in D.C. is hazardous for one's health. Even going to D.C. can be hazardous to one's health. As Sam Husseini got a concussion from the State Department here last year. So it's hazardous to your health to stir up things in Washington, D.C. But Sam, running for Congress now. Go Sam. See how that turns out. What a guy. Wow, he's one of my heroes. Gary, so after surviving murder attempts and just all the outrageous things that he had to deal with when he was fighting the gangsters here in Ventura County, who are the judges and the developers, real estate tycoons, etc. They stole his business from him. And again, he actually tried to sell his business, and then the so-called buyer went bankrupt while it was in escrow. Well, then the Dare should have then gotten the end of the transaction, but not in Ventura County. They ruled that his business now was wrapped up in a bankruptcy suit, which is totally, again, it's outer space kind of legal rulings that they do. But this is how kangaroo court works. And so I watched Dennis's company get stolen here in Seattle, similar kangaroo court stuff. Again, no legal standing to do what they do. And so this is, and then the officials just rubber stamp it. And this is how corruption works. And Gary lived his last years in exile in Oregon. He actually had the business in his wife's name, and he had the deed to the place. And so actually there was a warrant issued in California for his wife's arrest. So she would have to literally give away her deed to these gangsters. And in fact, Gary lived the rest of his life in destitution. And these are the evil activities that go on in Ventura County and elsewhere. Professor Wean, my professor partner, the man was a saint. He had his life ruined and shortened by the events in Ventura. Brian O'Leary's life-shortening event happened in California. Back San Diego. He was in San Diego when that happened. San Diego comes up a few times in these kind of activities. And again, Brian had his life-shortening event, a so-called heart attack, right after he refused an offer from the military to work on classified UFO projects. Mark Cummings had his heart awakening in California. This time it was at Berkeley when he invented a free energy prototype. And he thought he would hide out in Southern California and still make it happen. And he eventually learned he was harshly disabused of his youthful naivete. And to his credit, he realized he was in over his head, and he stopped trying to do that. And he eventually learned that his treatment was actually relatively mild. And so, murdered inventors and this kind of stuff comes with the territory in the free energy field, etc. And then Sparky Sweet in LA came to a grim end in LA for persisting in his free energy efforts. And Mark and Sparky had their equipment and documentation seized, kind of like how we had our stuff stolen, our technical materials stolen there in Ventura, and our equipment seized. This is what the authorities do. They just take everything. And I got to give more examples of the authorities just seize everything. Yeah, this is how they play. During our Ventura days, I actually heard of a California professor came up with a way to mine platinum much more efficiently, and he was murdered by the Eastern oligarchy there in California. He was a professor at Cal State San Bernardino. My mentor even heard of a federal magistrate who disappeared when he was about to rule against an aerospace corporation there in California. In fact, I have a whistleblower relative in California, and he was told he was lucky to be alive. Yeah, he blew the whistle on hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud and abuse, and he didn't know it, but he was lucky. He's lucky they didn't take him out. And so this is how they play ball. And then when I began my studies of the medical record, time and again, I would encounter scientists and physicians who were attacked by corrupt officials and others in California. And I already had a dose of that myself. I worked at a medical lab they tried to take it out. So that was some of my early experience with the medical racket. And murder attempts, murders, imprisonment, kangaroo into prison. In fact, one MD actually ended up working on a chain gang. In fact, I actually met an MD, Dr. Brody, who actually had to move to Nevada. He moved to Reno from California to stay out of prison in California. And he actually used a dark field microscope like Nassans, similar to Rife. And so, in his practice. And Royal Rife was wiped out in California, in fact, San Diego. And then when the man who tried to revive his work was kangarooed into prison in California, my wife actually fled to Mexico. And so, anyway, so these are some examples of what I encountered in my journey of the awesome corruption in California. And that's kind of my point is California is a heart of darkness, but it gets portrayed as some kind of liberal state with the cachet of Hollywood and San Francisco. and wine country and all this kind of stuff, but it's only a thin veneer that hides corruption that beggars the imagination. And many idealists have had their lives ruined or met their demise in California. And those who survived the experience had a harsh awakening, like I did. And I eventually learned this is just not that unusual, I guess. I was taught that the Hitler of California, Junipero Serra, was some kind of saint who was actually sainted in 2015, but his greatest accomplishment was almost total genocide of the coastal Indians of California. Yeah, to this day, I hear people talk about how wonderful and liberal California is. And it's like, what a joke. What a joke. And, it's all over. The whole world's corrupt, but California has a special place in my heart for how corrupt it is and how people who try to make a dent are taken out repeatedly over and over and over again. And this is how the global rackets operate. And there's a line full of corrupt officials eager to do their bidding. And every state's like this, but California is kind of in a class by itself. And so I've titled this post "Idealists in California's Meat Grinder." So anyway, I only go to California when I have to. So bye for now.